Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog. Tonight, I am going to talk about the PMC again. The rational problems that we have dealing with class right now and its justification again, but also where I think we need to maybe be more careful in defining class and what that means, because I think it will be painful for both individuals and the left to actually do. The reasons for that are complicated, and I think we have to go into it. 3 things spawn this today. Two conversations that I personally had. One with a friend of mine who, coming out of Detroit, got up in my face and asked me, how do all these leftists always hit us with these strange vocabulary, but they don't seem to be doing anything for the people? And I said, well, a lot of that's gatekeeping. And she's like, yeah, it's treehouse politics. And I'm like, that's probably fair. But there's also analytic categories, and the meeting of immediate needs and long-term needs are often not the same thing. And she looked at me puzzled. And I said, we can do charity to help the poor all the time, but that doesn't empower them. It makes them dependent. And she's like, that's a conservative argument. And I'm like, is it? And the conservative argument says that, but then has you act as the individual. I'm talking about groups of people acting for themselves in a long-term interested fashion. A lot of left politics right now is not interested in that. But it's also interested in abstracting away real class distinctions, real power relationships. Often, there's an academic movement to say that the focus on power relations leads one to paranoia, and that we should talk about recuperating the social good. Now, I don't need to tell you that while I don't automatically reject some of the notions that might be in that, I find this to be a fundamentally conservative argument put up for essentially progressive values that can no longer be justified in the same teleological assumptions of natural law that they were historically justified in. No. It's more difficult than that and more painful. Another friend called me and told me, why do you deny the PMC exists? And I'm like, it's not cohesive. And he's like, okay, fine. I'm like, who do you think is in the PMC? And he goes, I don't think it's everyone with a degree. I don't think it's every barista with a degree. I don't even think it's like every teacher. I think it's the people who actually have professional status and manage things for either corporations, the media complexes, or the government, including the military. Which led me to say, well, if that's the definition that you mean, I think that's a real thing. That's 5 to 7% of the population. It acts fairly coordinatedly. There are some fissures within it, but it's a pretty cohesive class category. The way PMC, however, was originally defined, however, by John and Barbara Ehrenreich, doesn't follow that. And in Catherine Liu's Virtue Hoarders, it's defined culturally. As white-collar left liberals afflicted with a superiority complex over ordinary members of the working class. I find Liu's conception too vague, and I find the Ehrenreichs too broad. After all, both John and Barbara Ehrenreich admit that by 2006, 35% of the population was employed in, quote, PMC groupings. They also began to argue in Barbara and John Ehrenreich, the real story behind the crash and burn of America's managerial class, from an essay in Alternate way back, that the PMC was in ruins due to economic shifts out of Fordism and into neoliberalism, which changed their professional prospects. Some members, such as highly qualified scientists, jumped ship to become more lucrative posts in direct service of capital. Others, lawyers, tenured professors, doctors, found themselves in increasingly corporate workplaces at the top. And then many, such as people in the backgrounds of humanities, spiraled down closer to the retail workforce, or in strange positions like nursing or teaching. Now, I think the Ehrenreichs were right, but the problem is the conception was too broad. There is an elite that manages things for structural capital. And as I've told you, the real wealth of the country is largely sitting on its laurels right now. The bourgeoisie does participate in politics, but a lot of the bourgeoisie that participates in politics is a new rentier bourgeoisie. All right. Marxists want the clarity of a primary conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But I've never been able to produce that final showdown or even consistently produce a politics for the working class for itself, not just in itself for its immediate interest. Dylan Riley and Robert Brenner, in an essay I'm going to spend a couple of episodes talking about, 7 Theses on American Politics, actually try to deal with this without relying on the PMC thesis. They talk about a new non-class that has emerged since the 1990s. What is this non-class? Well, it is a class of political apparatchiks that administer to different fractions of capital, but their base is oriented to different factions of workers. So they are basically positing a political class of managers of money. Now, that's not the same thing as the PMC, but it looks a lot of the same. Furthermore, in the work of Michael Lynn and Peter Turchin, people who I do not share my political views with, but people whose analysis I find somewhat compelling, that there has been an overproduction of elites, and then elite justification has shifted in generational cycles. And since the bourgeoisie that has real wealth has largely invested it in families and no longer feels the need to actively participate in the economy and thus its politics in the same way, leaving that to newer fields of the economy, a tradition that actually goes all the way back to, the quote, robber baron / captain of industry, however you want to flip that weird coin, who themselves have diffused their initial great holdings of wealth from being the first bourgeois class of the United States, the old money, that it's not even really traceable, even when I pull up things like Forbes 400 richest families, because you have 6 generations of diffusion. But everybody who's talked about the Robert Brenner, Dylan Riley thing, as I will go into my series on that I'm going to do, and people who look into the past have to admit that there's some fundamental change in the economy, partly driven by changes in profitability rates, but not just that. And actually, the way Brenner defines profitability, it's unclear that he is correct about all aspects of it trending downward. We have to deal with the fact there are tangible classes here. And I don't like abstract domination or political capital as an explanation. There is an elite. There is a tendency of oligarchy to develop. That oligarchy has changed its tactics. There is also a political legitimacy problem that has emerged as a crisis of general liberalism. And we are in total crisis management mode, where the old managers, the people who were trained to manage the administrative state of the Fordist time period, at the end of neoliberalism, have all retired or died. My friends, they are the generation between the greatest generation and the baby boomers, and they are mostly gone. People who say generational politics aren't real do not deal with the fundamental changes in the structure of work and capital in the 20th century. Yes, it manifests in these categories of branding. That's why capital keeps up, but it's more substitutes with that, particularly before and after the baby boom, which is tied to a spike in profitability and a rapid decline of profitability. The likes are not normal for capital, and were tied to the reinvestment that was made possible after World War II. Such war conditions are unlikely to come again, and war will mostly just drain the coffers of the state to enrich private contractors these days. It neither removes excess stock of capital, nor does it relieve pressure on the workforce. And in fact, the workforce's pressure is being relieved naturally by the baby boomers, making demand more inelastic, fulfilling the traits of full employment. And we see the managers of capital respond as current, decredentializing teachers in the front lines and some of the most conservative areas, which also happen to be some of the most contested with some of the most poverty. This is not an accident, although one cannot explain one just in terms of the other, as many leftists in service of liberalism try to do. This is a more complicated problem. If you limit your discussion of the PNC to a definition different than what was offered by John and Barbara Ehrenreich, or even what is offered by Catherine Liu, but to the actual managers of capital, both in their political and bureaucratic top, people who maybe don't actually earn all their living from capital gains earnings, but do earn enough to be structurally invested in capital clearly, then yes, Virginia, there is something like a PMC. And their modes of justification have largely switched. What capitalism may have been corrupted by right-wingers, but the first mentions of it I often saw on the left. And it wasn't that capitalism had become rogue, it was that in the expansion of markets, it made sense for capital to appeal to new internal markets, which no longer factored old hierarchies, which it had used to discipline labor in the past. Furthermore, if one ties virtue and the virtuousness of rule and of wealth based on that virtue, one has a legitimacy claim that others do not have. So one sees the movement from the entrepreneurial creating new wealth and valorizing wealth from stolen but quote pristine land, a myth, one aided by the state, even in its earliest forms, no doubt. But still something that was more believable in the 19th century, to the joint stock corporation, to the cadre of management. I've dealt a lot with James Burnham. Burnham, the Trotskyist. Burnham, the conservative. Burnham, the theorist of the managerial class. I have my critiques of Burnham. Burnham thought that the military was the actual core of the managerial class and worked in concert with corporations. And for a long time, I thought I was wrong about that because he predicted basically the Eisenhower administration into perpetual future. He's wrong about that. But if you look at where the core of all of our development comes from, it is out of the military, where they're still generalist. DARPA is the primary funder of a whole lot of our technological research, from GPS to a lot of the stuff that's going in Chat GPT, etc. DARPA's sharing of that with the private sector, as opposed to the Soviet refusal to release that to its general public because of fear of military intelligence breaches, led to the capitalist world getting technologies that were better developed in the Soviet one earlier, and thus winning a whole lot of the technological game. That's beyond the scope of this video, but when you study it, I promise you'll see it. So Brenner comes up with political capitalism to talk about what we have right now, which is a world where gains, if not declining, are at least more stagnant. They might spike up and down, and I think there's evidence that they do in a way that maybe Brenner's story doesn't deal with. But we see that for whatever reason, it is no longer incentivized to invest directly in production. So investment doesn't happen the same way. And I think this is an undeniable fact. Why that is the case is a bigger question. Attempts to mitigate that through things like modern monetary policy have not been political enough. Even if you could do, and the MMPers are correct on the way money works, and I think there are elements of which they are, and then elements like the inability to come up with something that I think is a viable theory of inflation. Other than it's always price gouging, or the government refusing to negotiate prices down, as if all governments had equal power on the world market, are non-starters. But there are things that are fundamentally true. A highly productive society with a large military and a strong base of production cannot go bankrupt by printing money. Eventually, it might decouple, and then you'll have inflation crises. But what causes that are more complicated than just the money supply. But for a political MMT to work, it has to be far more targeted than what Stephanie Kelton puts on offer. And that's if it can work. As you've heard in my theories before, I'm iffy there. And partly because some of the things that are assumed are helpful to the very classes that we're talking about. Rentiers have an advantage in a 0% state loan interest environment because they already have a ton of capital and now can collateralize it for cheap, and also not claim their income by writing it off as debt. And when the debt is that cheap, it is cheaper to have the debt than to pay the taxes on the income. You see where this is going. That doesn't invalidate other claims of MMT at all, but it's something you have to ask. Why is that so important in this constellation of ideas of modern monetary theory? Who's fighting over that? And who's winning? It's not clear. What is clear is wealth transfers have not decreased even during this, quote, quasi-social democratic Keynesian period that Robert Brenner calls Bidenism as Keynesianism without growth, a concept that shouldn't even be possible. The basic idea of Keynesianism is that monetary stimulation through governments being the employer of last resort and through injections of funds directly into the economy, which are then later extracted through taxes to balance out and stop inflation crises. That's part of his theory of money, just stating as what he studies it. Should create growth because consumption should create the need for more economic activity, but that is not the case. A paradox that I don't think Brenner and Riley really deal with. Nor do I love the fact that the PMC is based off a definition that can no longer be true of it. But there is a managerial class that are elites. And they have agendas beyond capital. And they do justify themselves in particular ways. A mixture of crisis and inclusivity, but in ways that do not fundamentally change the primary relations of even races, but much less classes within the United States. After all, racial wealth is largely unchanged, despite 10 years of protesting. And equality has only gotten worse, despite 13 years of protesting. On every key metric that seemed possible in 2018, the social democratic left has failed. And Brenner is right. It was based on delusions. Delusions that I've been trying to hint at for a long time, but myself could not totally articulate. Now, I don't think Brenner's answer to what is going on is sufficient, Brenner and Riley, and I'm going to go into videos and all these theses. But it's important that we talk about this. It's important that you understand it. But let's also talk about why my friend pushed back on me when I said, okay, it's not specific enough. And then my friend goes, if you want people to really look at their class situation, not just in terms of the primary contradiction, but how they actually live their lives and whose interests form into political categories, it will be painful. It will hurt. People will want to look away. They don't want to talk about lumpen because it's too moralizing without looking at the effects. They want to admit either that the class positions of people who fall into the social category of lumpen, and I'm going to delimit it probably more than Marx ever did. I mean people who survive off the exploitation through direct expropriation, through extra legal means, or through exploitation through fraud of the general population and particularly the working class. We can call it whatever. And one of the things I have to say is if you look at class in a fine-tooth comb, you see that large sections of the working class now have many traits that we have historically considered tied to lumpen. Low rates of marriage, divorce, and children. Shorter lifespans due to deaths of despair or spontaneity, such as drinking, the effects of long-term drug abuse, the inability to maintain long-term employment, etc. I've talked about the precaritization, which is a polite way of saying lumpenization of the working class. Now, should you use that in public? No, those words are alien. All right? This is another thing that I'm trying to get people to understand. The way you do analysis does not have to match the way you do polemics. And expecting your analysis categories to line up cleanly to what is easily polemicizable is, well, dumb. You have to code switch. You have to introduce the categories in ways people can see, and then you can demand all these other categories. But one of the fundamental things of Marxists that my first friend who was arguing with me is right about is we tend to use language that's utterly alienating and not explanatory anymore. We insist on categories that have multiple definitions, yet not pick the definition that we're using. Why do we do that? Well, it's a sorting mechanism for an in-group. It's a way to build a social cohesion. It actually works a lot like cult dynamics. Not saying that these groups are cults, but I am saying that some of the incentives are the same. But we have to be honest about this. What are the trends we see in the working class? Service sector and blue-collar workers do not see themselves in the same thing, and they align to different parts of the class. Furthermore, and this was pointed out by Matt Karp in his response to Brenner and Riley, which, again, I'm making videos about that, and I'll go into that in detail. A lot of the working class is depoliticized. It is not even like it's picking sides just off of regional opportunism anymore. It's just stop playing the game. Sees no purpose in it. Functionally anti-political. This is bad. Rational, but bad. Where's the left been on all this? Pushing working class lines, but using the working class as a cipher without defining it in a way that made it real to people. And then not looking at the psychology of the various strata and functions and sections within the class except in the broadest terms like race and gender. Which, yes, there's a lot to learn by looking at race and gender, particularly if you go in and look honestly about it. But there's also a lot to learn by looking at other differences within the class, within the classes, and these new classes that seem to be emerging. While the fundamental driving point of capitalism, even if it's structuralized, has remained the same. There's a reason why production is still the base of all of this. The most productive economies and industrial output are still the ones that have the most rentier economies, even if most people aren't employed in them. We have not overcome anything about capital or class. But maybe we need to look at it in a far more fine-tooth comb. And when we do, I think it will be ugly. It won't just be the PMC who are scrambling against each other. In fact, in some ways, the elite managers of our society are one of the most aligned classes in it. Even the bourgeoisie itself may be more self at odds. You have groups of people using other groups of people who are competing over a slice of allocation when growth is thin. And it's been that way for a long time. But the way we allocate and deal with it is different. Focusing on national divisions alone, or racial and gender divisions alone, will only tell you part of the problem. Unless you will have an incomplete analysis, and those in charge of the status quo will have the advantage. The more incomplete your analysis, the more the house has the odds. We have two presumptions here at Varn Blog. They're my presumptions. One, that the historical development of the economy and the historical development of ideas can tell you a lot about how we got where we are. And two, that alone is not sufficient. You have to look at the real sociological, material, and cultural reality of the present. Not just to understand the base and the superstructure, but also the parts of the base and the parts of the superstructure. The relations of production have cultural elements, have legal elements. The state is never neutral. Those who relate to it are never free of interest. We have to deal with that. And there's not just one way to do it. But one thing we cannot do is to pretend that the fun we've been having since 2016, when all the leftists don't feel like they're out in the cold anymore, and we even touch on the popular discourse, and good liberals will flirt with democratic socialism. And the progressives will pretend that we have the same interest, which we do not. Nonetheless, we have to learn from all of these people and all of these classes and all of these motivations. And we have to be brutally honest about its effect. We have to be honest about the effects of addiction on the working class and those pushed out of it. We have to be honest on the effects of large-scale public debt. Not government debt. That's not what I'm talking about, but private credit card debt. We have to be honest about what the lack of discipline and literacy does. Just because something was given to us by the bourgeois for their own reasons doesn't mean it's not helpful to us. And you should turn away. Will it look the same in the future? Absolutely not. I'm not going to say that we can set a top times arrow and tell it to turn around. Moral progress may be a myth, but times arrow is not. You do not step in the same river twice, my friend. This will be painful. And I don't think Brenner and Riley's answer of political capitalism as a new phase actually totally explains it. But I do think their 7 theses may give some grounds of talking about a lot of this while touching on some of the problems. For example, they reject the PMC thesis because they think it relies on a lie of treating the working class as their own bourgeoisie on the market. I think there's some truth to that, but I don't think if we defined it like my friend did that we're actually doing that. Is that what Barbara and John Ehrenreich are talking about? No. Is that what Catherine Liu talking about? No. Is that what the people at Compact Magazine is talking about? Probably not. Adolf Reed does use that kind of limited definition. And then the other 2 people I mentioned who are often lumped in with PMC thesis are not actually PMC thesis in Bristol when you call them that. And they don't have left-wing politics. Do not be a fool. That doesn't mean that they're all wrong. Discounting something from the other side just because the other side says it, that's cowardice. And it's drinking your own Kool-Aid. If you want more analysis like this, like and subscribe. I'll put the 7 theses by Brenner in the show notes. Everything else comes from conversations with my friends who like to remain anonymous. Have a great day. And start looking at the hard things. Because it's not because we don't need to be optimistic. It's not because we need to be cynical about ourselves. But it is because we have to be honest. And we have to compete people who throw truths at us by dispelling anything in the truth that hurts our politics. Not by saying it doesn't exist, but by fixing the problem undergirding it. And if we can't do that, we haven't earned our position. Good night. Like and subscribe. If you're interested in more, subscribe to the Patreon, and good luck.